Hello, we have Ms. Vicki Alger, Dr. Katie Alanese, and Dr. Chris Kugler here with us today to talk about, we're going to discuss discussions.
That's right.
Okay.
Great.
So the easy way out would be for me to sit here and go, discuss. Since I'm not on the camera. But discussion boards are one of the tools that we're talking about in this section that contributes to several things. It contributes to communication with your students. It contributes to being present, and it contributes to giving feedback. It is probably the major tool that we use in the online environment to actually teach. So let's talk about the discussion boards and what the expectations and the role of the instructor is. What would you say is the most important thing, Dr. Kugler, if I were to ask you, what is the most important thing to keep in mind about a discussion board?
I think the most important thing is always in an online course in general, but in a discussion board in particular, is just to be present, So just to try, we have some like standards that we try to go by in terms of commenting upon at least one comment upon every thread, but just to be present, even if you don't feel like you have something exceptionally helpful, insightful to say, just to see that as one of the prime ways in an online course to be interactive.
Okay. So, Ms. Alger, would you say that you can be too active in a discussion board?
Well, yeah, you can definitely have too much presence to where you almost stifle the students, because the whole point is to simulate a classroom discussion. And so if, just like you would in a classroom discussion, you as the instructor wouldn't necessarily be dominating the conversation that's happening. You would be wanting the students to. You're more a facilitator in that role. And so if you over-facilitate or even under-facilitate, you don't help to guide the discussion in an appropriate direction for whatever it is that you're discussing.
Okay. So, Dr. Alanese, Dr. Kugler mentioned a comment or an interaction on each thread. Yes. What exactly does that mean?
So that means that on any given week, for any given discussion forum, you would want to comment upon at least one student's post, one student's thread, basically. So you would want to be actively engaged in that discussion. And the hope is that you would do at least one, maybe more than one. But in order to promote further discussion, you might want to ask questions. You might want to even ask the other members of the class how they feel about this particular student's response, and then that can encourage a more engaged discussion for everyone in the class.
Okay, so we've even had some conversations among the group here about, as an instructor, when do you do that? Because there are deadlines about when a student is supposed to submit their first post. And then there are deadlines about when you're supposed to have your replies. And since it's an asynchronous environment, that can happen at all points during that week of a discussion. So what is a good practice for that? Dr. Alanese, I think you have an answer for that.
I believe that there are many different strategies for engaging in a discussion forum. My personal opinion is that it's sometimes very helpful to jump in as early as possible, because if you are asking questions and not so much guiding the discussion in a way that you're hoping the discussion will go, but more just asking questions in order to help the students think about different perspectives, I think that it can be helpful to jump in early so that you can help the students start to think about questions that you had in mind as you were creating that discussion forum. What is the content that you really, really want to dive deep and explore? And I think that if you can ask questions early, sometimes that can help the students to think about things that you're wanting them to discover over the course of the week.
So a couple of other pieces that are important when we talk about expectations around discussion boards. Dr. Kugler, one of the things that we emphasize is, how do you set up and wrap up that whole week as far as getting the students over that hump of getting started, and then to say, okay, here's what we discussed at the end. What kind of advice?
Yeah, sure. So the first piece is, as they both said, can I come back in?
Absolutely.
The first piece, as Dr. Alger said, is, and as Dr. Alanese said as well, to combine what they said, you want to make sure that you distinguish between interactions which are wholly evaluative. And what I mean is someone has written a paper or performed a test and you're performing an evaluation of that. In the discussion board context, which is not really straightforwardly evaluative, you do not want to jump in and simply say, this was a bad idea, this was a good idea, I'm done here, because it tends to foreclose, shut down the conversation. So I have been persuaded, actually pretty recently, to stop my procedure of jumping into discussion boards after pretty much everybody's done with them the next week. And so I'm trying now to jump in a bit earlier, but it is important when you jump in earlier to be aware that this is a different interaction than just simply an evaluation. And at the end of weeks with discussion boards, there are a couple of ways. One is to produce a text post, like an announcement of some kind, that kind of, what one finds when one teaches often is that students succeed and enjoy the same things a lot of times, and students stumble over the same things a lot of times. And so I think at the end of the week, it is helpful, encouraging, and orienting for students for you to provide some kind of roundup of, hey, lots of you seem to enjoy that. This seemed to have gone well. Great. This seemed to have been a particular stumbling block for a lot of people. So let's maybe provide a little bit more discussion and reflection on that. One of the ways in which I like to do that is to provide end of the week, usually Sunday, roundup posts, video posts, where you can kind of have another touch point with students. And hopefully that's adds a little texture to the course, and you can kind of talk about, that in that way.
So, Ms. Alger, Dr. Kugler touched on something. We were talking also about being present and feedback for the students and grading. So what kinds of tips do you have about actually grading and giving feedback as it's related to a discussion? Because they do get graded on it. So how do we do that with a discussion board?
Well, one thing that's important, I think, to keep in mind is it's a discussion. It's a classroom discussion. And so if you're too evaluative, you can actually cause students to become more hesitant in future weeks to share. And so I think being careful about overcorrecting grammar or overcorrecting, spelling and things like that, because you wouldn't correct them in a classroom setting by saying, oh, you put a question mark instead of an exclamation point on the end of your sentence that you just spoke. So I think you have to be kind of careful to not be too critical of them when they're trying to express themselves. And yet, at the same time, you want to make sure that they are following what the prompts are, that they are responding to all the prompts. Sometimes students kind of pick and choose, and they don't necessarily respond to the whole thing, which is another opportunity for you to jump in sometime during the discussion to say, hey, I see that you answered this question, but what do you think about this part of it? To try to help guide them into that. So I feel like the discussion board is really an opportunity for discussion. And so for the evaluation, I think you also have to kind of keep that in mind, that this is a classroom discussion. And so it's more of a participation grade, maybe. You could look at it that way rather than, and as long as they're participating effectively and, staying on topic and being respectful of the other students, that, I think that you can grade it from that perspective.
One thing I want to have somebody touch on before we close up here, and that is, what about that student that nobody seems to be replying to their post? What do we do about that?
It's such a great question. And I would say that it helps when we model replying to that student's post. When we, as the instructor, can be intentional about doing that. Of course, it would not probably be appropriate to reply every single week. That definitely would maybe send a message to other students that is very obvious, in terms of how we're choosing to respond. But I think that we can certainly model by replying. And one thing that I would say is also in the introductory discussion forum, as everyone is introducing themselves, I do think it's important to reply to every single student. Yes, I do
too. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes. And I think that when we do that, we show the other students in the class that we value each member of the classroom community.
It's about getting to know each other. And you want to know them, and for them to know that you have something in common. That being able to make that connection. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because a lot of instructors don't tend to interact in the introduction board, but I think that is very, very important.
So essential. Absolutely. Yes. And so as they see that we value everyone's contribution to each discussion forum, I think that it can help the students to think in terms of, how can I be responsive, not to just to those that I'm familiar with or those that I most agree with, but anyone in the class community. And I think that can really have ripple effects over the course of the term, which is important.
Well, I think we've just about covered it all. I sure appreciate each of you. Is there anything that you can think that we need to add to that?
The only thing that I would add, just as far as a tip that I have found to be effective with discussion boards, as far as, to bounce off of Dr. Alanis's conversation about, how much do you respond and, and who do you respond to, is I do keep an Excel spreadsheet with all my students listed, and then the discussion board, so I can keep track of who I've been responding to, so I can make sure that I basically spread the love around and not just respond to the same student every time. And then I make sure that even the strong students who don't really seem to need my feedback, it still is such a nice thing when you see, that the professor has responded to you and that something that you've said resonates with them.
I did think of something else I want to bring up for this topic right now, and to make sure we touch on for our introduction to our new adjuncts and faculty, the integration of our faith. The discussion board is a really excellent place to do that. So Dr. Kugler, what would you say about the importance of that, and how to reassure the folks watching this that it's okay?
Yeah, it is okay, and it's necessary to who we are as Houston Baptist University to integrate your faith into what you're teaching, and not always in an awkward, heavy-handed way like, oh, I see that you mentioned the color red, that made me think of the blood of Jesus. It doesn't have to be like that. Just being aware yourself of the ways in which you see God at work, revealing himself in whatever discipline that you practice and that you teach, and in taking those opportunities in the class to take advantage of those opportunities. And it's been my experience that students, by and large, are very appreciative when you do that. And it creates an environment which goes beyond other secular educational experiences they've had, and it's part of the reason why they want to be somewhere like this. Right. And so, yeah, absolutely.
And just for our faculty that are watching this, if you haven't taught here at HBU, and this will be your first time, you're going to find some of the Christian integration, spiritual integration, hopefully woven into the content of your course.
Absolutely.
So that will give you an opportunity to tie those into some of the things you're discussing as well, hopefully, during the course of the class. Yes. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.